Imagine a sound so profoundly violent that it does not just register in your ears, but rips through your chest cavity, collapsing the air in your lungs and blurring your vision. June 1942. The Crimean Peninsula is suffocating under a blanket of dust, heat, and the stench of unburied dead. The Soviet defenders of Sevastopol, entrenched in some of the most heavily fortified, deep-earth concrete bunkers the world has ever seen, believe they can hold out indefinitely. Their fortresses are buried beneath meters of solid rock, reinforced with thick steel plating, designed to laugh off the heaviest artillery barrages the advancing German army can throw at them. For weeks, standard artillery shells have been raining down, exploding harmlessly against the impenetrable surface of the Soviet defensive line. But then, the earth begins to tremble. It is a slow, rhythmic, mechanical vibration that travels through the bedrock itself. Miles away, hidden behind the German lines, an engineering abomination is being prepared. It is not a tank, it is not a standard artillery piece. It is a man-made moving mountain of Krupp steel, weighing 124 tons, creeping forward on massive tracks that crush the earth beneath them. The soldiers operating it do not just load a shell, they use a specialized crane to hoist a piece of ammunition the size of a small automobile into the breach. When the firing lanyard is pulled, the shock wave is so catastrophic that the artillerymen have to retreat into dugouts just to survive the overpressure. The massive barrel recoils, spitting a 2-ton meteor of high explosives into the sky. Minutes later, that meteor strikes the indestructible Soviet bunkers. It does not just explode on the surface. It burrows deep into the concrete, detonating with a force that vaporizes the steel, turns the rock into liquid shrapnel, and instantly obliterates everything inside. The Soviets did not know it at the time, but they had just been introduced to the single most terrifying, utterly destructive self-propelled weapon ever deployed in human history. This was not a myth. This was not a prototype left to rust on a drawing board. This was the Karl-Gerat, and the true story of how this apocalyptic machine was built, deployed, and ultimately doomed is one of the darkest and most awe-inspiring chapters of the Second World War. If you believe that the extreme, terrifying realities of historical warfare need to be exposed and remembered, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not sugarcoat history here. We dig into the trenches, the blueprints, and the minds of the men who engineered pure destruction. Type the word beast in the comments right now if you are ready to witness the full, terrifying power of the ultimate siege weapon. To truly understand why the German High Command felt the absolute necessity to authorize the construction of something so obscenely massive, you have to go back to a time before the war even began. You have to understand the psychological shadow that loomed over the entire European continent in the 1930s, the Maginot Line. Following the horrific, stagnant trench warfare of the First World War, the French military had constructed an artificial border of unparalleled defensive magnitude. The Maginot Line was not just a series of trenches. It was a subterranean empire of interconnected fortresses, disappearing deep into the earth. It possessed concrete walls up to 3 meters thick, armored retractable turrets, underground train networks, and self-contained power plants. German military planners stared at this border and realized a chilling truth. If they were to ever wage war against France again, a frontal infantry assault on the Maginot Line would result in the deaths of millions of German soldiers. Conventional artillery simply could not scratch it. You could fire 150 mm shells at those bunkers for a decade, and you would only succeed in chipping the paint. They needed something else. They needed a weapon capable of altering the very geography of the battlefield. In 1936, the German arms manufacturer Rheinmetall received a set of highly classified requirements from the military command. The mandate was simple in its phrasing but impossible in its execution. Build a weapon capable of penetrating 2.5 meters of reinforced concrete, or 1 solid meter of armor steel. The weapon had to be mobile. It had to bring its own destruction to the enemy's doorstep. The engineers at Rheinmetall looked at the physics of the problem and realized that to crack concrete of that thickness, they needed a projectile of incomprehensible weight, falling from an extreme height to maximize terminal velocity. They calculated the necessary caliber. It was staggering. 600 millimeters, 24 inches in diameter. To put that into perspective, the main guns on the most powerful battleships of the era, the floating steel leviathans that dominated the oceans, were generally around 380 to 406 millimeters. The German army was asking Rheinmetall to build a gun significantly larger than a battleship's main armament, and then figure out a way to drive it across the land. The development process was a nightmare of physics and material science. The weapon was named Karl-Gerät, named after General Karl Becker of the artillery branch, who heavily championed the project. The challenges were immediate and seemingly insurmountable. When you fire a shell that weighs over 2,000 kilograms, the recoil force generated by the explosion is enough to tear any standard vehicle to absolute shreds. The chassis had to be a masterpiece of shock absorption. The engineers designed a massive, tracked vehicle, essentially a giant mobile platform. But even with its enormous size, the gun could not be fired while resting purely on its suspension. The recoil would have shattered the road wheels and snapped the tracks like fragile twigs. To solve this, Rheinmetall devised an incredible, highly complex hydropneumatic suspension system. When the Karl-Gerät reached its firing position, the entire chassis would be lowered. The belly of the beast would physically rest on the solid earth, transferring the catastrophic recoil energy directly into the ground rather than through its own mechanical joints. Even then, the earth beneath the weapon would often crack and crater just from the backblast. But designing the gun was only half the problem. The logistics of actually operating this monster bordered on the absurd. A machine that weighs 124 tons cannot simply drive down a paved road or cross a standard European bridge. Its sheer mass would instantly collapse any infrastructure it touched. Its top speed, pushed to the absolute limit of its massive Maybach V12 engine, was a blistering 6 miles per hour, and that was on perfectly flat, completely solid ground. In the mud and ruin of a battlefield, it was essentially a static object. Therefore, the Karl-Gerat could not march with the army. It had to be transported. The Germans engineered a customized rail transport system specifically for this weapon. The entire vehicle would be hydraulically lifted and suspended between two specialized railway cars, floating in the air as it was transported across the European rail network. Once it arrived near the front lines, it would be painstakingly unloaded, reassembled, and slowly crawled to its firing position. It did not travel alone. The Karl-Gerat required a small army just to function. It needed specialized munitions carriers, modified Panzer IV tanks fitted with heavy cranes just to lift the shells from the ground and place them onto the loading tray of the mortar. A single firing sequence required a crew of over 20 men, functioning in perfect, terrified synchronization. If a single gear slipped, if the loading tray misaligned the 2-ton explosive shell, the resulting accident would instantly vaporize the entire crew. By the time the Maginot Line was actually bypassed and France fell in 1940, the Karl-Gerat was not yet ready. The great defensive wall it was designed to destroy had been conquered through speed, blitzkrieg, and flanking maneuvers through the Ardennes forest. But the monsters had been built. 6 of these operational behemoths were eventually completed, each given a mythical name by their crews: Adam, Eve, Thor, Odin, Loki, and Zeus. They were weapons without a war, until Adolf Hitler turned his eyes toward the east, the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. Here, on the vast, unforgiving steppes of Russia, the Karl-Gerat would finally unleash the apocalypse it was designed for. The true baptism of fire for the great mortars came at the siege of Sevastopol in the summer of 1942. The port city of Sevastopol was widely considered one of the strongest fortress cities in the world. The Soviet military had spent decades digging in, creating a massive network of coastal batteries, subterranean ammunition bunkers, and heavily armored gun turrets known as the Maxim Gorky fortresses. The German 11th Army, commanded by Erich von Manstein, was bleeding itself dry against these defenses. Infantry assaults were being cut to ribbons by overlapping fields of machine gun fire. Artillery was completely ineffective. Manstein needed a miracle, or he needed a monster. He called for the heavy siege artillery. In total secrecy, the Karl-Gerät mortars Thor and Odin were transported across the continent and slowly, painstakingly crawled into the hills surrounding Sevastopol. The preparation for the barrage was meticulous. The target was the Maxim Gorky 1 battery, a massive, heavily armored twin-gun turret that was unleashing a torrent of high-explosive death upon the German infantry. On June 6, 1942, the earth around the German positions suddenly dropped. The deafening roar of the 600 mm mortars firing echoed across the Black Sea. The massive shells arced high into the sky, disappearing into the clouds before gravity pulled them back down on a near-vertical trajectory. The impact was cataclysmic. When a 2-ton armor-piercing shell moving at terminal velocity strikes a concrete bunker, the laws of physics become terrifyingly visible. The kinetic energy alone is enough to induce seismic tremors. When the internal fuse detonates the high explosive filler buried deep within the shell's thick steel walls, the resulting explosion does not expand outward, it expands inward, turning the bunker itself into a deadly weapon. The shockwave instantly liquefies the internal organs of anyone caught in the subterranean chambers. Spalling, chunks of concrete and steel breaking off the inner walls at supersonic speeds, turns the bunker into a giant fragmentation grenade. The Soviet defenders of Maxim Gorky Fonj endured a psychological and physical hell that defies human comprehension. The Karl-Gerät shells systematically shattered the invincible armor plating. One direct hit completely destroyed the power supply of the fortress. Another direct hit struck the massive gun turret itself, ripping the armored steel apart like cheap tin and permanently silencing the Soviet guns. The psychological impact on the surrounding Soviet troops was devastating. To be hiding in a bunker, believing yourself to be completely safe from the war raging above, only to have the roof cave in with the force of a meteor strike, broke the morale of even the most hardened veterans. The sheer concussive force of the explosions caused widespread panic. Men were found dead in their defensive positions without a single mark on their bodies. Their lungs collapsed and their eardrums shattered by the massive overpressure of the blast waves. Sevastopol eventually fell, its defenses literally pulverized into dust by the heaviest concentration of siege artillery ever assembled. The Karl-Gerat had proven its terrifying worth. But the story of the beast does not end in the sun-baked hills of the Crimea. Its darkest chapter was yet to come. In a theater of war it was never intended to see. 1944, the Warsaw Uprising. The Polish Home Army, in a desperate and heroic bid to liberate their capital city from the retreating German occupiers before the advancing Soviet Red Army could seize it, launched a massive armed rebellion. Urban combat is notoriously brutal, a grinding, bloody affair fought room by room, staircase by staircase, basement by basement. The Polish resistance fighters turned the dense, historic architecture of Warsaw into a fortress. Barricades were erected, buildings were interlinked, and the German forces found themselves bogged down in a meat grinder, unable to utilize their standard armored advantages in the tight, rubble-strewn streets. The German command, operating under explicit orders to level the city of Warsaw to the ground as a brutal lesson to the rest of occupied Europe, decided to bring in the ultimate terror weapon. The Karl-Gerat ZU was deployed to the ruins of Warsaw. Using a 600 mm siege mortar in dense urban combat is a strategic absurdity. It is like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito on a glass table. The weapon was not designed to target individual buildings. It was designed to destroy mountain fortresses. But the Germans did not care about precision. They cared about psychological annihilation. When the massive mortar fired its 2-ton shells directly into the heart of the Polish capital, the results were apocalyptic. Entire city blocks simply ceased to exist. Historic apartment buildings, multi-story stone structures, were reduced to localized craters in a fraction of a second. The devastating shockwaves shattered windows for miles, collapsing weakened structures and burying hundreds of resistance fighters and innocent civilians under thousands of tons of brick and masonry. The sound of the Karl-Gerät firing became a psychological torture for the people of Warsaw. They could hear the massive, dull thud in the distance. They knew that a 2-ton shell was tracing an arc through the sky above them. They knew they had roughly 60 seconds before it hit, and there was absolutely nowhere to hide. No basement was deep enough, no shelter was strong enough. A direct hit meant absolute vaporization. The deployment of the Karl-Gerät in Warsaw remains one of the most brutal applications of heavy artillery against a civilian center in modern history. The weapon that was built to break the greatest military fortifications of the era was instead used to crush the spirit of a desperate, surrounded city. But the era of the giant guns was rapidly coming to a close. The massive, slow, mathematically complicated weapons were becoming obsolete even as they fired their last shots. The nature of warfare was changing. The skies, once controlled by the Luftwaffe, were now completely dominated by Allied air power. P-47 Thunderbolts, British Typhoons, and Soviet Sturmovix prowled the air, looking for any sign of German armor. A weapon that weighs 124 tons, moves at a walking pace, and requires a massive logistical train of specialized rail cars and ammunition carriers cannot hide from the eyes in the sky. The Karl-Gerät had become a massive, incredibly expensive liability. As the Red Army pushed relentlessly from the east and the Americans and British broke out from Normandy in the west, the German military apparatus began to collapse. The logistics required to move the giant mortars fell apart. The customized rail lines were bombed into oblivion. The specialized fuel required to run the massive Maybach engines dried up. The beasts were stranded. In the final chaotic months of the Second World War, the crews of the Karl-Gerat faced a grim reality. They could not retreat with the weapons. They were too slow. They could not use them in a mobile defense. They took too long to set up. Orders were given to destroy the weapons to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Some of the mortars were detonated by their own crews, massive internal charges ripping the barrels apart and shattering the complex chassis. Others were simply abandoned in the mud, out of fuel, out of ammunition, left as towering steel monuments to a lost war. The American Army eventually captured several of the abandoned units, marveling at the sheer scale of the engineering. The Soviet Army captured others. Today, only one Karl-Gerat survives, a silent, rusting testament to the insanity of extreme military engineering, resting in the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. When you look at the history of the Karl-Gerat, you are forced to confront the terrifying reality of what human beings are capable of creating when driven by the absolute necessity of destruction. It stands as a dark masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a weapon that pushed the boundaries of physics, logistics, and metallurgy to their absolute breaking point. It was a dinosaur of steel and fire, perfectly evolved for a highly specific type of warfare that vanished almost as soon as the weapon was built. It cracked the unbreakable fortresses of the Crimea. It leveled the historic streets of Warsaw, and it ultimately collapsed under its own impossible weight. The Karl-Gerat is a reminder that in the darkest chapters of history, the greatest achievements of human intellect and engineering are often dedicated entirely to the science of annihilation. If this deep dive into the most terrifying siege weapon of the Second World War changed how you view the sheer scale of historical combat, do not leave without hitting the like button. Share this video with anyone who is fascinated by extreme military history and the untold stories of the battlefield. Subscribe to the channel and make sure your notifications are turned all the way on, because we will never stop bringing you the most intense, heavily researched, and unfiltered stories from the front lines of history. I will see you in the next one.